Testing, 1, 2, 3. Good. Looking at page 43, the last 4 verses of this section, Manjushri's verses, and maybe we can get to all 4 of them tonight. Slowly going to read in Chinese and then maybe read 2 of the verses in Chinese and then do 2 in English. It's the Yi Jing Guang, that section. Have it? Yes. Okay, let's try it together. Yi Jing Guang Ming Zhe, Suo Xing Wu Ran Jiao, Zhi Yan Mi Bu Zhou, Guang Da Li Zhong Sheng. Next verse. Yi Shan Wei Wu Liang, Wu Liang Fu Wei Yi, Liao Zhi Zhu Shi Jian, Xian Xing Bian Yi Jie. Yi Jie, there we go. Just go through straight English as it appears in BTS, and then maybe we'll tweak it a bit as we go along. English is, he is one who has a pure and bright mind. All he does is free of defiling attachments. No place that the wisdom eye does not see. Vast and great is the benefit he brings to living beings. His one body becomes limitless, and the limitless returns to one, completely understanding or fathoming all worlds. He manifests a shape or a form that pervades everywhere. Tonight I want to talk a little bit about not just these verses, but how we might approach translating them and understanding them. Understanding them is actually something of a more formal discipline called hermeneutics. Hermeneutics comes from the Greek, from the deity Hermes, who was an intermediary being between people and the gods. And Hermes also is considered the messenger spirit. The primary function of Hermes in the mythology and in Greek literature was to interpret the messages or the words or the instructions of the gods to people because people couldn't understand them directly. They were too far beyond their reach. So Hermes is the intermediary, the bridge between the human and the divine, particularly between the instructions and messages and teachings or precepts of the divine and the human. So this discipline that has to do with the study and understanding of the principles and criteria for interpretation or retrieval of meaning. And this applies very much to these Buddhist texts. It's used throughout for classical literature and in biblical studies. But it's also an important dimension of reading classical Buddhist texts, maybe indispensable, because when we read them, we have to ask the question, how are we to make sense of this? How are we to retrieve the meaning of the author or authors? How are we to make sure that we're getting it? And obviously texts like these, like the Avatamsaka, in a sense are very hard to get at, are very hard to retrieve. So I've been introducing some concepts of Buddhist hermeneutics, and one we talked about a couple of times, and last week was this idea. And by the way, these hermeneutic principles and criteria are coming right out of the text themselves and right out of the tradition itself, and not being brought in by or borrowed from sort of Anglo-Western philosophy and classical studies. It's not to say that those aren't useful and helpful, but we often overlook what the Buddhist texts themselves offer us in the way of guidelines, principles, criteria, and I would say even strategies and further practices, engaged practices that help us retrieve meaning. And one is just very obvious, it jumps out. If you hope to understand these texts, you have to, as much as possible, enter into the mind and the understanding or the disposition of those who are presenting and speaking it. In other words, some state involving precepts, concentration, and wisdom. And the degree to which one's precepting and concentration and the corresponding insight that comes from that is developed and full, to that degree the texts start to talk and reveal their meaning. One of the texts actually uses a metaphor for this and says it's like there is a jewel in a dark room on a pedestal that has multiple facets, but you can't really see it. When you cultivate Shila Samadhi Prajna, you generate a light, and so the light you generate shines on that jewel and reveals all these facets and dimensions. So in the same way, one of the hermeneutic principles of these texts is you have to be cultivating to some degree your person through purity, concentration, and some form of corresponding insight in order for these texts to reveal their meaning, in order for the facets to show. So tonight, and that's one hermeneutic there, is just the idea of self-cultivation with the three non-outflow studies. But also you have the key principle, bu'ar, non-duality. And that would suggest, in these texts, we've seen it again and again occur. It occurs in most of the texts that you'll ever study in the Buddhist tradition. And this non-duality means there is a link and an interconnection and a continuity rather than a divisive break between the human and the divine, between the worldly, the world transcending, here between Buddhas and living beings, between afflictions and awakening, bodhi. All of these exist within an interrelated continuum and are not split off from each other. This becomes a very important hermeneutical tool because it leads to the reading of the text as directly related and speaking to and from the human, and not of another realm or an abode that's far removed or distant or not accessible to the human. So the degree to which you close the gap between the human and the awakened, between Buddha and living being, is a matter of study and understanding the text as best you can through translation, through language, through concepts. But it's also stimulated by and advanced by self-cultivation, practice. So study and practice become part of the non-dual, and again, they're presented as non-dual. Study informs practice, practice sheds light on text and study, and there's a non-dual relationship, reciprocal relationship going on between the two of them. So that's another Buddhist hermeneutic, the non-duality of study and practice. If you take that along a continuum of other ideas, the one I'm going to introduce tonight is I'm going to present an idea called the hermeneutics of immediacy. And that follows along the one I advanced earlier. I didn't advance, the text advance of non-duality. For indeed, if between living beings and Buddhas, between the ordinary and the extraordinary, it's a question of degree difference and not kind, of degree versus kind, then in that, these texts have to be and are best read through a hermeneutic of immediacy. So let me go into that and I'll define it a little bit. But if we saw up to now, last week, and somebody might have thought this, there's all this not, N-O-T, N-O-T, N-O-T. Not to be found in marks, not to be found in features, not to be found in sights and sounds, not in the realms, the skandhas, and the places. In other words, the awakened being, the awakened state, the Tathagata, Buddha, however this is referred to here, is not found in any of these. And it's also not found in words and language. So you see the previous verses, I don't have to repeat them. So one is left, if they're not in all of that, then where is it? Where is it to be found? What's left? And ironically, this hermeneutics of not is intentional. You see this again and again in the text, especially in the negation using wu or sunyata. In the Platform Sutra, you see it wushang, wudu, wuzhi. This teaching of our school is not to be found in appearances and attachments in words and language and so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So the question is, where is it to be found? And ironically, it's to be found when the absence of those mental activities quiet down. It's to be found in stillness and purity. It's to be found in direct understanding. So the immediacy, hermeneutics of immediacy, is just another way of saying the direct teaching versus provisional that you find in the Platform Sutra. So if it's not what's left? This. This. And this goes back to an early hermeneutic presented in a text set from the 3rd century before the Common Era. And it says basically, what one wishes to know is that. Let's see here in Buddhist, the state of the Tathagata, the Buddha, full awakening. The second line of the verse says, but our means of knowing that is this, the individual, the person, and the psychophysical apparatus that the person has available. The third line says, well, then how can you know that, the state of the Buddha, the Tathagata, and so forth? Only by polishing, perfecting this. So there's a hermeneutic there. We want to understand the text. How can we know the text? We can only know it through this. Oh, I see. We want to know that. We can know. How do we know that? Only by perfecting this. Our means of knowing that is through this. So there's a reciprocal thing going on here. The text is actually in an interactive relationship with us. If we do our part, which is really sincerely cultivate, clear the mind, find stillness and purity, the text will become very, interestingly, not only evident, but alive. It's almost as if this is the gateway to finding a Shanjurshur, a living Kalyana Mitra. The text, in a sense, are coded and condensed and passed down as distillants. And to open that up, we have to add the chemistry, if you will, or the solution or the element of our own cultivation, and suddenly this thing melts, opens, and unfolds. So, give you, and the text is very interesting and poignant. If you see in the lines of the text above, and this is one of the things about the hermeneutics of immediacy in the text, is that you will find embedded in the text themselves clues to what we have to do in order to retrieve meaning. So if you look at these verses, they come, the Tathagata cannot be found in marks, words and language, sophistry, sights and sounds, and so forth. And then it says, only in the power of self-mastery, tsudzai, free from defiling attachments. I'm quoting the text. Subtle and wonderful. So you see, there are the clues. What I have to do on my part is, again, self-mastery, which begins by mastering one's passions and impulses and habits, getting control over the sensory horses, so to speak, but also then freeing the mind from defiling attachments, essentially cleansing klesha. And by doing that, suddenly what is coarse and defiled evaporates, so to speak, or reveals the subtle and the wonderful. The subtle and the wonderful is not in that only, in those teachings or in that state, but in this. So it's activating the subtle, wonderful sensitivity and sensibility of the person. This is not mystical or magical. This is something that's humanly possible. And this is the art of self-cultivation. So to sort of support this, there's a wonderful poem by Han Shan. These are from the Cold Mountain Poems, and Han Shan's from about the 8th or 9th century. But I think his poem really captures, if it's not to be found in all of that, is it not to be found then? Is it a mystery? Is it sort of out of reach? Or is it attainable? And if it's attainable, how? And this is his verse. It's very concrete. I've used it before, but I really like it in regards to what we're talking about tonight. He says, and this is the verse, talking about food won't make you full. Babbling about clothes won't keep out the cold. A bowl of rice is what fills the belly. And it takes a suit of clothing to make you warm. And he says, and yet, without stopping to think about this, consider this carefully, you complain the Buddha is hard to find. Turn your mind within. There is the Buddha. Why look for him outside? So this is exactly the non-dual, the hermeneutic of non-duality. Buddha's not outside, Buddha's inside. Outside and inside are non-dual. You're just looking in the wrong place. How you find the Buddha? Only by eliminating the defilement or the confusion of your own state at this point. They're not two. And then you have also the immediacy of its right here and now. Food, clothing, sleep, awakening is right here in the world, in our daily actions, in our habits, in our cultivation. So, if I follow this a bit, which is why I've been hinting over time, the weather is changing, it's spring, and with spring comes all these wonderful flowers, but all the pollen that goes with it. So when I'm outside, I'm just coughing and wheezing and hacking, and I get a rough throat. So, by the way, this is just tea I'm drinking. It's nothing. If you use the hermeneutics of non-duality, and if you use the hermeneutics I'm talking about tonight of immediacy, and let me say what immediacy means. It's the quality or the understanding of bringing one into direct and instant involvement with something. Bring you into direct and instant involvement. And it gives rise, it's accompanied by a sense of urgency and excitement. It's not passive, it's not laid back. It's directly pertinent and relevant to the present time, place, and your purposes. When you have immediacy, something seems real and important, and you feel really deeply involved with it existentially now. Moreover, immediacy implies something to the effect that when you have that immediate presence of an object of knowledge with your mind, there's no distortion, inferences, or interpretations. It is direct, and this goes back to the Huineng's direct teaching. This is what meant by the mind pointing to the mind. It's not something far out of mystical. It means you are directly seeing it unmediated, hence immediate, not mediated by intermediate agencies or inferences, interpretations, distortions. So this is what is meant by immediacy. And I believe very strongly, not only the text, but my teachers who lectured on this and tried to teach me about this were constantly using these, but without calling them. Now, they did call it non-duality, but the immediacy was implied, but it wasn't explicit. So I'm adding that, but I'm not adding it as something from my own imagination. I am putting a term on something, and I'll give you examples of this. So when we translate, not only do we try to see it directly important as relating to me and my state, even though the gap might seem great, the assumption is that that gap is artificial and it's distanced by my own confusion, anger, greed, and so on and so forth. To the degree that that lessens, the gap is not as big as one would think. One way to help this with translation is to translate Buddha as Buddhas, as the text says, Manjushri as Manjushris, Buddha as Buddhas, Tathagata as Tathagatas. And you can even use the language that what you're hinting at here are descriptions of the perfected human state. These aren't descriptions of deities or gods far removed from the human, but Buddhas, Tathagatas, all of these are presented to us through the text as the culmination, the consummation, if you will, of the human, the perfection of the human. That's why it said when the path of human is walked to or perfected, Buddhahood accomplishes itself. Again, non-dual. So if you would then in your translation don't say the Buddha, but you say a Buddha, and you don't say the Tathagata, but you say a Tathagata, meaning limitless, boundless Tathagatas, as many as there are as living beings. How many Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are there potentially? As many as there are living beings. So if living beings are boundless, in the first vow I vowed to liberate them all, then liberated living beings would become Buddhas and Tathagatas, Bodhisattvas. So by doing that in the translation, just changing the to makes a great deal of difference, I think, as I hear it, and as an audience might hear it, as being universally available. When we were on our bowing pilgrimage, Master Hua used to occasionally stop by in his route, especially as we got closer to the city of 10,000 Buddhas, because he would go back and forth every other week or so, and sometimes come along the highway. And I remember a particular time he stopped, he was quite excited, he took us to the car, and in the back seat there were 3 little Buddhas sitting there. And I reached out, touched them. He said, don't touch them, they're still wet. I said, what? He said, well, I painted them with gold painting. Oh, you made those? Yes, I made 3. So he had a pottery plaster form, and he would get up very early, before we all got up, at 2 or 3, he would get up and put these, mix the, the plaster? Yes, mix the plaster, put it into the mold until it hardened, and then take it out and then do the painting. And I thought, and he said, you see, just from plaster and dirt, we can get Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And from the likes of you, maybe the same. It was like talking to Heng Sure and I. And he said, I'm just going to do 2 or 3 every day until I get to 10,000. And he says, I'm stopping at 10,000 not because that's how many there are, but that's infinite. And those little 10,000 Buddhas will go into the Buddha Hall at the City of 10,000 Buddhas. So if you go into the Buddha Hall of the City of 10,000 Buddhas and you look up the hall now, you'll see these little niches with these little golden Buddhas, all the same because they're cut from the same plastic mold, but they were made by hand by the master. in a kind of symbolic way to show his teaching and transforming vows, but also the persistence of patience in doing it. And the idea was, with each step that you bow, you will eventually reach your goal, because these greatest things are accomplished by small, persistent, patient steps. But behind this was the idea, he said, when people come, they too can become Buddhas. At the city of 10,000 Buddhas, that's why it's called 10,000 Buddhas. He said you could call it the city of 10,000 living beings, but living beings have the potential to become Buddhas. So we call it the city of 10,000 Buddhas because everyone who comes here must change. This is what it's about. It's changing ordinary living beings into Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and that's why it's a transformation factory, if you will. So if you're already a Buddha, you don't have to come. But if you're not and you want to, that's what it exists for. But then, if it exists as a transformation factory, as I said, then you're back to Bu'ar. Because if it's a transformation, not a creation, then the ordinary gets transformed into Buddha. And it isn't created by some other agency. So, let me support this by a section of text from the master, who wrote this as a preface to, as an introduction, a very brief introduction to the Avatamsaka preface, which is Master Chungwang's poem, hitting at the essence of the Avatamsaka Sutra. Wonderful, wonderful poem. It starts with going and returning with no border, movement and stillness have one source, overstepping words and thoughts by far, embracing multitudes of wonders, yet more remains. This can only be the Dharma realm. That's the first verse. And then it goes on to other verses. It's incredible. To this preface, then, he wrote a prologue, which is a commentary and sub-commentary on the Avatamsaka Sutra. Also incredibly, inconceivably wonderful. But Master Hua wrote an introduction to the preface, this poem, and I'm quoting to you now this line of his because I want to demonstrate that my idea of the hermeneutics of immediacy comes directly out of the text itself and then Master Hua's interpretation of the text, as well as Master Chungguan. So the Master Hua says, the principles discussed in the sutra are designed to correct our faults and bad habits. It is absolutely not the case that the sutra was Dharma spoken for bodhisattvas with no relation to us, or that it was Dharma spoken for arhats with no relevance for us. Do not think all I, as an ordinary person, can do is listen to the sutra. I could never aspire to the states of a sage. To think that way is to throw yourself away. Is to separate, to divorce yourself from the sages. If we are able actually to apply and cultivate according to the principles in the sutras, then we are certain to become Buddhas. Upon hearing one phrase of this sutra, we should ask ourselves, how should I act? How should I be different? Should I run after, meaning follow my faults and bad habits, or should I rely on the principles of the sutra to cultivate? If you can constantly ask yourself that question, you will certainly obtain great benefit. The reason you have not obtained great benefit is simply that you look upon the sutra as the sutra, having no connection with yourself. Actually, when the Buddha spoke the Flower Adornment Sutra, or when a Buddha speaks the Flower Adornment Sutra, it is spoken for all living beings, including you, me, and everyone else, right here and now in the present. The Buddha is face to face with us, immediacy, speaking it for us from his golden mouth. When we listen to the sutra, it's the same as having the Buddha take us by the ear and speak these principles right to our face, telling us to use the sutra's Dharma doors to cultivate. None of the Dharma doors go beyond the essential self-nature of each and one of us. That's the part of the introduction. A very powerful piece. I look at this again and again and continue to get benefit from it. But he's saying none of the sutras, none of the teachings go beyond this, the essential nature of every person. And that to see it as separate is to actually disrespect ourselves. It's not to cherish ourselves. All of this is pointing to this idea, what I call immediacy. Okay, so that being the case, I just want to go through and read these back a little bit. When we read earlier, a Buddha's body is not born and is not produced. Again, this means it comes about from what is already existent. It's not created ex nihilo, from nothing. You know the expression ex nihilo? Familiar with that? This appears, for example, in the Bible when God creates man, it's ex nihilo, it's from nothing. But in this, when it says the Buddha's body is not produced and transcends sophistry, it means it's already existent. It's not a collection of the skandhas or dharmas of differentiation. And then the text says, I'm just repeating from last time, by obtaining the power of self-mastery, one is certainly to see this. So again, the clue here in terms of how do I retrieve meaning? Through the power of self-mastery, mastering oneself. The Buddha attained the power of self-mastery, and then Master Hua's commentary, if you cultivate the way, you can too. You see, embedded in his commentary, if you cultivate the way, you can too, you can attain it and be able to see a Buddha's Dharma body. Again, in his commentary, bringing out the non-difference between if you cultivate and if you don't cultivate, it'll always remain distant. Then the next line is his activity, or what you would call his practice, or his life, is fearless, apart from the path of words. The meaning of this is direct, immediate apprehension. When it's saying it's apart from the path of words and it's fearless, it means you are so right on, you are so attuned, you are so trued, jung. You're directly responding without calculation, without hesitation, without wordy babble and debate and spin and second thought. This is what it means to be apart from language. It doesn't mean that you don't speak. It means that the language you're using is so direct that it immediately has the effect of liberation. And your action is not calculated or second-guessed or cost-benefit analysis. That's where fearlessness comes from. It's right on. And then it says, body and mind are level and equal, inside and out, all is liberated. Master Hua's commentary, liberty means you are without attachments. If you have no attachments, you will become free. Conversely, if there's anything you cling to and can't let go of, it will tie you up and afflict you. And then he says, if you're able to attain liberation, then you have proper mindfulness. So proper mindfulness, what we talked about earlier, the sati, has to do with constantly, 24/7, seeing things as they really are. And at that time, if you do that, he said, your mindfulness will manifest. But this doesn't just happen once. It doesn't manifest for 1 day or 1 month. How long for it? How long is it? The Master says, for an eternity of kalpas, we're quoting the verse here, he dwells in proper mindfulness, forever unattached and unfettered. Again, in this language, you're seeing the key, if you will, the hermeneutical key, not only for retrieval of meaning, but for embodying, becoming one with the text. Actually, and it's very interesting, dwelling in proper mindfulness, if you think of it almost organically, it says one abides for an eternity of kalpas, but you could take it away and reverse it and say, proper mindfulness doesn't have a time or place. So instead of saying one dwells in proper mindfulness for an eternity of kalpas, you change it around to say, by no clinging to attachments, one is always in proper mindfulness. And proper mindfulness then, according to this, is not coming or going. It has no border. Now this really starts to go deep into what it means to end birth and death. Because birth and death come about because of this bordering, because of this bifurcation. But proper mindfulness, the mind unattached, ying wu shou zhu sheng er qi xian, let the mind be unattached, clinging to nothing. If that's the case, that's proper mindfulness, then there is no time and no place. There's no death and there's no birth. I mean, I'm talking about this. I'm not saying I have experienced this, but you can see where the text is actually pointing here. It is accessible and it's understandable, but it has to be cultivated in order to be reached. But that proper mindfulness, that's what the Shurangama means, when the mad mind stops and therefore is in proper mindfulness, aware. That very stopping is bodhi itself, bodhi, nirvana. So this is a state of mind and not a place or a distant sphere, if you will. Then the text says, he is one who's had a pure and bright mind. And all he does is without defiling attachments. There's no place that his wisdom eye doesn't see. So again, wisdom is not something you get, but it's something that opens up when you let go of what stands in the way. Wisdom is already whole and complete. It's only covered over by defiling attachments. Then Master Hua says, how do you purify your mind? You have to cut off all delusions, view delusions, thought delusions, delusions like dust and sand. Then your mind will naturally be pure. And when your mind is pure, your wisdom and your light will manifest by themselves. It's not something that comes from without. And then finally, and this is really where, to me, it moves up to the next level of compassion. And the closing line says, and vast and great is the benefit one brings to living beings. Then in that position of proper mindfulness, free of defiling attachments, seeing things as they really are, somehow the heart of compassion just blossoms, and vast and great is the benefit you bring, without even necessarily speaking. And the Master says this is because people and self are the same substance, and everyone in the Dharma realm is your kin. I'm reading his commentary. You should think of yourself as being the same with all living beings in the Dharma realm. And if you're able to be public-minded and not selfish, then you won't do everything for yourself. You won't think, I got to get some money, buy some clothes, have a nice place to live. These things are most important to me, so I should make a lot of money to buy them. This is his commentary. And then he does this wonderful verse. I was thinking about this. He throws in, I don't know where this is from. It's could be another Chinese expression. Master Hua was always good at this. He would quote poetry or verses from various Chinese authors, and sometimes he would write his own, but this one is very interesting. Basically, in the lecture that he was giving at this point, he was saying, whatever you lust for, whatever you hanker for, will in fact tie you up and tie you down. And the more you lust and hanker for it, the more you get it, the heavier becomes the weight tying you to the unenlightened state and samsara. So he said, therefore, one of the meanings of leaving home is getting to the middle way. Just enough clothes, not too much. Just enough food, not too much. A place with a roof over your head, not much more. If you stay within that sufficiency, I won't say fewness. Fewness is relative, but sufficiency is the middle way. If you say it's fewness or much, you miss the principle. It's a question of balance. For example, how much is enough food at lunch? How much are enough clothes? Depends on where you live in the season. If you live where I grew up, you really do need warm clothes because it gets to minus 20 and 30 in the winter. I don't need that in California here. So if I accumulate those kinds of clothes, that's too much. In Wisconsin, it's just right. Same thing with food. How much is enough? If you're sick and not well and healthy and weak, you might have to eat more, and you might have to eat more potent food to restore balance. If already you're young and healthy and full of qi, you might want to reduce. So too much, in the saying says, becomes too little, and too little can become too much. So this middle way is a principle that he was always sharing with us. We were rigid sometimes, and we would interpret it as what I ate one day was exactly what I was going to eat the next day and the next day and the next day without according with the conditions. And the same thing would happen during a meditation retreat. In a meditation retreat, because you're returning the light, and this is not just a metaphor for your intellectual, but it's physiological as well. Returning the light brings a fullness to one's being that is usually not experienced because of outflows. And when you're not outflowing, then you don't need as many clothes to be warm and comfortable. You don't need as much food to feel full. And actually, you don't need as much sleep to feel rested. It's very interesting. It's an experiment you can run in doing a session. And it happens naturally. That's why when the sessions go for long hours, it doesn't burn people out. In fact, you can see people getting more invigorated. And when they're not eating as much, you can see, they have a glow. Where's that coming from? It's not coming from the food they're eating at the session, believe me. It's coming from the non-outflow. Wei Guan, Guang Fan Jiao, returning the light illumined within. Anyway, Master Hua quotes this thing here about, so if you spend your life accumulating money, food, clothes, and a place to live, he said, and this is the verse, the chicken in the cage gets fed, but it is very near the soup pot. The wild crane receives no food, but it roams throughout heaven and earth. This is the verse. I really like that. In other words, the pig or the chicken that gets well fed, it's for a reason, because it's very near the soup pot and it's ready to be eaten. Whereas the wild crane gets no food from the humans, but it's free to roam throughout heaven and earth. And then I'll stop there for tonight. It's a wonderful. And I want to continue next week this taking the verses tonight through with the commentary to bring out again this really important dimension, I feel, is how we can read these Buddhist texts within the principles and criteria that the texts give us for the retrieval of meaning. And the two I mentioned tonight were the non-dual and the immediacy, and I give you the commentary as well to support that. If that's the case, then what we call the gap between the received tradition, which are the text and the ceremonies and devotions, and the inspired tradition, which is the living embodiment, teacher to teacher, student to student, they become non-dual as well. Because we can activate the inspired tradition, the received tradition, through inspiration, in other words, the breathing in, the inspiring of our own cultivation. And therefore, you can be far away in a monastery in the woods or whatnot with one of these texts, and if you're really cultivating, it's if you're like there, right there with the teacher, translating, commentating, and guiding in the text. Conversely, if you don't see it as immediate and urgent and really relevant to you, you can be right there with Cheng Guang or even the Buddha himself, and it'll just be water off a duck's back, because there's no buy-in. There's no direct inspiration. So stop tonight. Jin Hui is going to You need this? Oh, you get your own. Okay.
So can you hear me? Well, it's okay? Okay. a bit speak from my own experience, speaking about this duality between text and or study and practice, cultivation and study. No, I'm Polish guy. Can I back to the years when I started? I heard often an advice, meditation, do Zen, do Zazen, throw away any text, burn them away. You don't need it. Why to waste the time? Direct teaching, right? Face your mind. Sit, just sit. And I started. I was sitting, and still in my heart I felt kind of empty, lost, without purpose, and still looking for a different painkillers to not face pain in my heart. And the meditation actually became one of them. I didn't meditate to see more clearly, rather to close my eyes, to not see what's going on, to run away. And the meditation became the one of the other my strategies at the time was a partying, playing around, or just not be responsible. I called this a freedom. It's a freedom, in my sense, at that time, freedom to hide from myself. Don't really face myself. And a lot of exchange from different circumstances and conditions, I met a person who introduced me to Sixth Patriarch Sutra with commentary of Master Hua. It was a Polish translation. And as we know, this is like Bible of meditation, right? It's a very important text from Zen. And what really struck me and hit me was especially the chapter of repentance. When I read it, it's like I saw first time in my life a mirror, like my mask dropped down, and I kind of saw someone who is following all the time the script, try to cover, pleased, just not be real in many ways, be a good actor, to pretend. It was not a really good actor, but more scary kid, someone who tried to find a escape mechanism. So the lesson was very clear. I need to change. I need to change, no more hiding. And in many sense, this was my kind of sense of urgency to deeply look at my lifestyle, to deeply change my lifestyle. So I always saying that I become a Buddhist when I quit my smoking, drinking, eating meat, many adjustments in my lifestyle. So this is why my kind of truly beginning a path. Tremendous changed, but of course easy, not easy. But I have a glimpse at least to how it is to feel alive, to feel open and be authentic. And I say that often that my Dharma recovery began at the time. And the text was extremely crucial for this process. Like Marty says, at the time I don't have so many community around me, any friends. So the text became for me a friend, become a mentor, become a teacher, become a therapist, a good therapist. And the recovery still is going on, and I kind of joking that I'm still in the recovery, and I call myself an animus self-aholic, right? To kind of trying to recognizing this delusion of self, and examine it. And of course, more text to explore, more to learn, and definitely there's also the sense of this excitement Marty mentioned and kind of enthusiasm to do it, especially with the friends, studying together, cultivating together. And meditation still is very central point of it, an important element. But rather just escaping mechanism, what I sitting on the cushion, but to learning, Martin mentioned about this, the proper mindfulness, to maintaining this meditation 24/7, including learning and studying the text, which actually the text pointing out to something with very important inside us, to connect, open, and closely read this book in the heart. Kind of deeply examine it, learn it, and transform it. And it's really exciting, It's very exciting. And it's not easy, it's challenging, but it's this kind of sense of really feel alive, have a true purpose, and it's worthy, I can say, to live this way life. So just want to share the few reflections about that. And yeah, and we have some announcements, right? So we still keep going the 10,000 Buddhas repentance at the City of 10,000 Buddhas. Anyone who is interested, you can find at BBM website the link.
By the way, that's the longest chapter in the platform.
Exactly.
And the shortest one is called Sitting Meditation.
Sitting meditation, ironically. Yeah. Yeah, so it's opportunity to really study or practice and study together with the text. And now it's a wonderful opportunity. I think that one day, just how many people usually? 345 or 350. There's a lot of people around the world. So, wow. Online. Highly recommended to do it. We have our daily practices. You can find also the link in the website. Virtual Buddha Hall is still open. For morning, recitation, meditation, 3 steps, 1 bow, morning reflections, evening ceremony, different lectures here and there. We also kind of slowly, carefully try to open up. And we have meditation for those who are vaccinated. There are requirements, and masked during the sit can be here at the Buddha Hall Thursday and Friday morning, 6:15 and 5:15.
In the
afternoon, right, too. So you can find the website, also you can register for that if you wish to join. And Jinchuan Shu, anything else? This Sunday? Oh. He's moved it up. So Jinchuan Shu just said that our monthly transference of merit and virtue from reciting the Great Compassion Mantra of whole group around the world. Since pandemic began, people are cultivating Great Compassion Mantra, and in the end of the month, we transfer merit and virtue from the whole month of practice. So this coming Sunday will be at 6. What's time? 6 to 6:45. Morning. Yeah? Okay. May every living beings, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of painters into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bowing respect to Triple Jewel.